What happens when everyone around you sees only weakness where you know there's strength? When your greatest challenge becomes the very thing that defines your identity in their eyes. Sometimes the hands that shake the most are the ones that hold the steadiest aim when it matters most. This is the story of Samantha Cooper and how 12 seconds changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Precision Firearms Academy's main courtyard as Samantha Cooper stepped out of her weathered Honda Civic. The parking lot was filled with pristine pickup trucks, tactical SUVs, and sports cars that gleamed under the Arizona desert sun. Her car, with its faded blue paint and a rear bumper held on by hope and duct tape, stood out like a sore thumb among the collection of expensive vehicles. Samantha's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her gear bag in the back seat. It wasn't nerves, though anyone watching might have assumed otherwise. The tremor in her hands had been her constant companion for the past 3 years, ever since the accident at the chemical plant where she'd worked as a safety inspector. A valve had ruptured during routine maintenance, releasing a cloud of toxic fumes that she'd breathed in before her emergency respirator could engage. The neurological damage was subtle but persistent, a fine tremor that ran through her fingers like electricity, making simple tasks suddenly complicated. The Precision Firearms Academy was the kind of place that attracted serious shooters, law enforcement officers honing their skills, military contractors preparing for overseas deployments, competitive marksmen who spoke in terms of milliseconds and millimeters. The facility sprawled across 40 acres of carefully maintained desert land with multiple ranges designed for different disciplines. There were tactical courses with pop-up targets, long-range precision lanes stretching out to 800 yards, and specialized training areas for close-quarter scenarios. As Samantha made her way toward the main building, her canvas gear bag slung over her shoulder, she could feel eyes following her movement. Not hostile exactly, but curious. She didn't fit the typical profile of an academy student. At 32, she was shorter than most, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wearing worn jeans paired with a simple gray t-shirt. Her hands, when she gripped the door handle, showed the telltale fine tremor that had become her unwanted signature. Inside the reception area, the walls were lined with photographs of successful graduates, trophies from various competitions, and certificates of achievement from law enforcement agencies across the Southwest. Behind the counter sat Rebecca Martinez, the Academy's coordinator, whose crisp uniform and military bearing suggested she'd seen more than her share of action before taking this civilian role. "You must be Samantha Cooper," Rebecca said, consulting her computer screen. "Here for the Advanced Precision Course Evaluation." "That's right," Samantha replied, setting down her identification and paperwork. As she handed over the forms, her hands betrayed their usual tremor, causing the papers to flutter slightly. Rebecca noticed immediately but said nothing, though her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. In a place where steady hands were quite literally a matter of life and death, any sign of physical instability was bound to raise questions. She processed the paperwork efficiently, but Samantha caught her making a small notation in the margin of her file. "The course instructor will be Marcus Thompson," Rebecca explained, sliding a visitor's badge across the counter. "He's one of our most experienced trainers, former Marine sniper with deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. He'll conduct your initial assessment this morning." As Samantha clipped the badge to her shirt, other students began filtering into the reception area. There was Jake Sullivan, a broad-shouldered police detective from Phoenix, whose confident stride and tactical gear marked him as someone comfortable in high-pressure situations. Next came Lisa Chun, a petite but fierce-looking woman who moved with the precise efficiency of someone accustomed to being the only female in male-dominated environments. Her gear was military issue, her posture ramrod straight, and her eyes constantly scanning for threats that weren't there. Behind them entered David Rodriguez, a private security contractor whose expensive equipment and casual arrogance suggested he was used to being the most skilled person in any room. His rifle case bore the logo of a high-end manufacturer, and his tactical vest was loaded with accessories that probably cost more than Samantha's car. "First time here?" Jake asked Samantha, his tone friendly but sizing her up in the way law enforcement officers do automatically. "Yes," she replied simply, not offering additional details. David glanced at her basic gear bag and civilian clothes. "What's your background, military? Law enforcement?" "Quality control," Samantha said, which was technically accurate, though it didn't begin to capture the complexity of her previous work as a chemical plant safety inspector. The group exchanged glances. In a world where credibility was often measured by how many acronyms you could attach to your resume, quality control didn't carry much weight. Lisa Chun's expression suggested polite skepticism, while David's casual dismissal was less subtle. "Quality control," he repeated with a slight smile. That single quote's different. Most people here are looking to develop tactical skills for professional applications. Before Samantha could respond, a voice boomed across the reception area. "Advanced Precision Course participants front and center." Marcus Thompson emerged from a side office, and his presence immediately commanded attention. Tall, lean, and weathered by years in harsh environments, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced real danger and emerged intact. His eyes were sharp and assessing, taking in each student with the kind of evaluation that missed nothing. "I'm Thompson, and for the next 2 weeks, I'm your instructor, your critic, and occasionally your nightmare," he announced with dry humor. "This course isn't about teaching you to shoot. If you can't already shoot, you shouldn't be here. This is about precision under pressure, about making impossible shots when everything around you is falling apart." His gaze moved systematically across the group, pausing slightly when he reached Samantha. Like Rebecca, he noticed the tremor in her hands immediately. Unlike Rebecca, he didn't hide his reaction. "This course has a 70% failure rate," Thompson continued. "Not because the shooting is necessarily difficult, but because precision shooting is as much mental as physical. Doubt, hesitation, physical limitation, any of these can be fatal in a real-world scenario." The emphasis on physical limitation wasn't subtle, and Samantha felt the weight of his scrutiny. She'd expected this reaction, had prepared for it mentally, but that didn't make it less uncomfortable when it happened. "We'll start with basic assessments," Thompson announced. "I need to see where each of you stands before we can identify areas for improvement. Some of you may discover this course isn't appropriate for your current skill level." Again, his eyes lingered on Samantha just a moment too long. The group moved outside to Range 3, a covered firing line with targets set at various distances. The morning air was crisp, but warming quickly as the desert sun climbed higher. Each student was assigned a firing position, with Thompson positioning himself where he could observe everyone simultaneously. "Standard evaluation protocol," he announced. 20 rounds at 100 yards, 10 minutes, prone position. I want to see your natural shooting ability before we start making corrections." The other students moved to their positions with practiced efficiency. Jake Sullivan's movements were smooth and professional. Lisa Chun's setup was textbook perfect, and David Rodriguez handled his expensive equipment with casual expertise. Samantha took her position at the end of the line, unpacking her rifle with movements that, despite her trembling hands, showed familiarity and care. Her rifle was a Remington 700, older but well-maintained, with a scope that was functional rather than cutting edge. Next to David's custom build with its titanium components and advanced optics, it looked like something from a previous generation. But as Samantha checked the action and settled into her shooting position, there was something in her movements that suggested this wasn't her first rodeo. "You may commence firing when ready," Thompson called out. The distinctive crack of rifles began echoing across the range as students engaged their targets. Jake fired with mechanical precision, his shots evenly spaced and controlled. Lisa's rifle barked in quick, confident succession. David took his time, clearly confident in his equipment and abilities. Samantha settled behind her rifle, her cheek against the stock, her eye finding the scope's alignment. For a moment, the tremor in her hand seemed to intensify, and she could feel Thompson's attention focused on her like a laser. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and found that place of stillness that she'd learned to access despite her condition. Her first shot broke clean and true. Then another. The tremor was still there, would always be there, but somehow, when she was actually shooting, when all her focus narrowed to that precise moment of trigger control, the shaking seemed to matter less. What Thompson couldn't see, what none of them knew, was that Samantha had been dealing with this challenge for 3 years. She'd developed techniques, workarounds, methods of compensation that had taken countless hours of practice to perfect. The tremor that made her hands shake when she poured coffee became irrelevant when channeled through the discipline of precision shooting. As the evaluation continued, a pattern began to emerge. Samantha's shots weren't just hitting the target, they were grouping tighter than anyone expected, including Thompson himself. But that revelation was still minutes away, and for now, all anyone could see was a woman with shaking hands, trying to prove she belonged in a place designed for the steadiest of marksmen, preparing and narrating. The story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed the end of the shooting exercise was telling. Thompson walked the line with his spotting scope, examining each target through the high-powered optics. His face remained impassive as he studied the results, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight pause when he reached Samantha's target. Jake Sullivan had performed exactly as expected: solid, professional groupings that clustered within a 4-inch circle. Respectable work for a police detective who probably spent more time on paperwork than range time. Lisa Chun's target showed the discipline of military training, with shots forming a tight pattern just slightly off-center, the kind of consistency that spoke to hundreds of hours of practice. David Rodriguez's expensive equipment had delivered impressive results, his shots forming an almost perfect triangle within a 3-inch spread. He stood behind his rifle with the satisfied expression of someone whose investment in premium gear had paid off exactly as advertised. But it was Samantha's target that made Thompson stop walking. Her 20 shots had formed a cluster that could be covered by a silver dollar. Not just accurate, but precise in a way that suggested either exceptional natural talent or extensive training that no one in her background check had mentioned. The tremor in her hands, so obvious when she handled paperwork or adjusted equipment, had somehow translated into surgical precision when it mattered most. Thompson pulled his radio from his belt. "Control, I need range verification on lane 5. Send someone to double-check target placement and distance markers." Within minutes, a range technician arrived with a measuring tape and digital caliper. The 100-yard distance was confirmed, the target placement verified. Samantha's grouping measured 2.3 inches center to center, with 19 of her 20 shots falling within a 2-inch circle. For a first-time evaluation with an older rifle and basic optics, it was the kind of performance that should have raised eyebrows. Instead, it raised suspicions. "Interesting results," Thompson announced to the group, his voice neutral but his eyes fixed on Samantha. "Some better than others, which is what we expect in an initial assessment." He walked back to where the students waited, his attention clearly focused on the woman who had just produced the best score of the day, while displaying what everyone assumed was a debilitating physical condition. "Cooper," he said, "walk me through." Your shooting background. Samantha straightened slightly, aware that the other students were listening with new interest. I've been shooting recreationally for about 4 years. Started after I had some medical issues that required physical therapy. My doctor suggested activities that might help with fine motor control. It was true, as far as it went. What she didn't mention was that those 4 years had included 2 years of intensive training with a former Olympic coach, hundreds of hours of dry fire practice, and a level of dedication that bordered on obsession. When traditional physical therapy had failed to address her tremor, she'd turned to precision shooting as a way to rebuild the connection between her mind and hands. Thompson's expression suggested he wasn't buying the casual recreational shooter explanation. 4 years, and you're producing groups like this with that equipment? David Rodriguez snorted softly. Probably got lucky. First-time nerves can sometimes produce random good results. Happens all the time with beginners. Is that what happened? Cooper? Thompson asked. Random luck? Before Samantha could answer, the range technician who had measured her target approached Thompson with a puzzled expression. Sir, you might want to see this. He handed over a digital photograph of Samantha's target, zoomed in to show the bullet holes. What it revealed was something that changed the entire dynamic of the evaluation. Rather than random holes scattered within a small area, the pattern showed deliberate precision. Several shots had gone through nearly identical points of impact, creating enlarged holes that spoke to consistent accuracy rather than lucky grouping. Son of a bitch, Thompson muttered under his breath. Lisa Chun moved closer to look at the photograph, her military training allowing her to interpret what she was seeing immediately. Those aren't random hits, that's surgical precision. Jake. Sullivan frowned, studying the image. I've seen SWAT snipers who can't shoot groups like that under pressure. David Rodriguez's confident expression faltered as he realized that his expensive equipment and years of competitive shooting had just been outperformed by a woman with shaking hands using what he'd assumed was inferior gear. Thompson handed the photograph back to his technician and walked to where Samantha stood. Up close, he could see the fine tremor in her hands, still present, still noticeable. But he was beginning to understand that whatever was causing that tremor wasn't affecting her shooting the way conventional wisdom suggested it should. I'm going to be direct with you, Cooper, he said, his voice low enough that the others had to strain to hear. Either you're the most naturally gifted shooter I've encountered in 20 years of instruction, or you've been less than forthcoming about your experience level. Samantha met his gaze steadily. I told you the truth about my background. Recreational shooting doesn't produce results like this, Thompson pressed. Not with hands that shake like yours. Not with basic equipment. Not without training that goes well beyond casual range time. The other students had formed a loose semicircle around them, no longer pretending not to listen. David Rodriguez was still staring at the target photograph, his confidence visibly shaken by the realization that his assumptions about equipment and skill had just been proven wrong. Maybe she had help, he suggested weakly. Someone pre-zeroed her rifle, gave her specific holdover points for this range. Thompson's patience was wearing thin. Rodriguez, that kind of accusation requires proof. Do you have any? No, but then keep your theories to yourself until you do. The rebuke was sharp enough to silence David completely, but it didn't address the underlying question that everyone was thinking. How had a woman with a visible neurological condition just outshot experienced marksmen using basic equipment? Lisa Chun approached Samantha with the directness that military training instills. I'm not trying to be confrontational, but those results don't match what we can observe about your condition. If you have specialized training or techniques, sharing that information could help the rest of us understand what we're seeing. It was a fair question, asked without hostility, and Samantha appreciated the straightforward approach. The tremor affects different activities differently, she explained. Fine motor tasks like writing or using tools are more difficult. But shooting, when I'm properly positioned and focused, seems to bypass whatever neural pathway is causing the problem. That doesn't make medical sense, Jake Sullivan interjected, his law enforcement background making him naturally skeptical of explanations that seemed too convenient. Maybe not, Samantha replied calmly. But it's what happens. Thompson studied her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how to proceed. In his experience, students either had the skills to succeed in his course or they didn't. But Samantha presented a unique situation. Someone whose apparent physical limitation seemed to coexist with exceptional ability, creating a contradiction that challenged his assumptions about what made an effective marksman. "All right," he finally announced to the group. "Interesting morning, but we're not here to solve medical mysteries. We're here to push your abilities beyond your current comfort zone." Cooper's results suggest she may have more experience than initially indicated, but that just means she'll face higher expectations moving forward. He turned to address Samantha directly. "If you can shoot like this under controlled conditions, with basic equipment, I want to see how you perform when we start adding stress, time pressure, and challenging scenarios. Because recreational shooting, however extensive, doesn't typically prepare people for what this course demands." The challenge was clear, and Samantha nodded her acceptance. She understood that her performance had shifted the dynamic, that she was no longer the underestimated newcomer who might struggle to keep up. Instead, she'd become the anomaly that everyone would be watching, waiting to see if her initial success was sustainable, or if the advanced challenges would expose the limitations that common sense suggested must exist. As the group prepared to move to the next phase of evaluation, David Rodriguez lingered near his equipment, still processing what had just occurred. His expensive rifle and premium accessories had been outperformed by basic gear in the hands of someone he dismissed as unsuitable for serious training. It was a humbling realization that would reshape his assumptions about equipment, ability, and the sometimes invisible factors that separate exceptional shooters from merely competent ones. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the temperature was beginning to rise in the way that Arizona desert days do, gradually building toward the intense heat that would define the afternoon. But the real heat was just beginning for Samantha Cooper, as her unexpected performance had elevated expectations and scrutiny in ways that would test not just her shooting ability, but her capacity to handle pressure that went far beyond anything she'd faced during her years of private practice. The afternoon heat was building as Thompson led the group to Range 7, a more complex facility designed to simulate real-world shooting scenarios. Unlike the sterile environment of the morning's evaluation, this range featured varied terrain, obstacles, and targets positioned at irregular distances and angles. The setup was designed to strip away the comfort of controlled conditions and reveal how shooters performed when perfection became significantly more difficult to achieve. "This is where we separate the range queens from the real deal," Thompson announced, gesturing toward the challenging course ahead. "Multiple positions, time constraints, and targets that won't cooperate with your preferred shooting stance. Some of you may discover that your morning performance was more about ideal conditions than actual skill." His eyes lingered on Samantha as he spoke, the implication clear. In his experience, shooters who excelled in controlled environments often struggled when variables multiplied and comfort zones disappeared. The course consisted of 6 shooting positions arranged in a serpentine pattern across 50 yards of desert terrain. Students would move from station to station, engaging targets at distances ranging from 150 to 400 yards, with time limits that prevented the luxury of extended sight alignment and breathing control. Each position required different shooting stances: prone, sitting, kneeling, standing, and 2 improvised positions using available cover. "You'll have 90 seconds per station," Thompson continued. 3 shots per target, 6 targets total. Miss your time window at any station, and you're disqualified from the exercise. The goal isn't just accuracy, it's maintaining precision while your heart rate climbs and your comfort disappears. David Rodriguez was examining the course layout. With renewed determination, clearly motivated to redeem himself after the morning's unexpected results. His expensive equipment would have a chance to shine in challenging conditions that should favor advanced optics and precision. Engineering over basic gear and questionable physical capability, Lisa Chun was already mentally rehearsing movement patterns and shooting positions, her military training providing a framework for approaching complex tactical scenarios. She understood that this type of exercise was designed to replicate the stress and unpredictability of combat situations where second chances didn't exist. Jake Sullivan appeared less confident than he had that morning. Police work, even SWAT operations, rarely demanded the kind of rapid precision shooting that this course required. His experience was more about careful deployment and controlled engagement rather than rapid movement and split-second accuracy. For Samantha, the challenge represented something entirely different. Her 3 years of private training had focused heavily on precision under stress, partly because her condition made it essential to develop techniques that worked regardless of external pressure. Her former coach, Dr. Alina Vasquez, had been a sports psychologist who specialized in helping athletes overcome physical limitations through mental discipline and adaptive techniques. "Cooper, you're first up," Thompson announced, his tone suggesting he was eager to see if her morning performance would hold up under pressure. As Samantha approached the starting line, her hands displayed their characteristic tremor. The other students watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, still processing the contradiction between her obvious physical condition and her earlier exceptional performance. The first station required prone shooting at a 200-yard target from behind a low concrete barrier. Samantha dropped into position smoothly, her movements efficient despite the tremor that remained visible in her hands. She acquired the target through her scope, controlled her breathing, and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The steel target rang 3 times in quick succession, indicating solid hits. "Time," Thompson called. 48 seconds. "Move to Station 2. Station 2 demanded a sitting position with back support, engaging the target at 250 yards. Samantha's transition was fluid, her body settling into the required stance without hesitation. Again, 3 quick shots, 3 metallic impacts confirming successful engagement. 35 seconds, Station 3. The pattern continued as Samantha moved through the course. Each position required rapid adjustment and immediate precision, conditions that should have maximized the impact of any physical limitation. Instead, she adapted to each challenge with a smoothness that suggested extensive practice under similar conditions. By the time she reached Station 5, which required standing unsupported shots at 300 yards, Thompson's expression had shifted from skepticism to genuine puzzlement. The tremor in Samantha's hands remained obvious during transitions, but the moment she settled into a firing position, something changed. The shaking that was so apparent when she handled equipment or moved between stations seemed to disappear when she was actually shooting. Station 6 required the most challenging position, kneeling behind partial cover, engaging a target at 400 yards with a 15-degree upward angle. It was the kind of shot that tested every aspect of a marksman's skill: position stability, elevation compensation, and the ability to maintain precision while fighting gravity and awkward body positioning. Samantha dropped into the kneeling position, using the concrete barrier for partial support while maintaining the required shooting angle. Her first shot rang the steel target cleanly. The second followed immediately, another solid hit. For her third shot, she made a slight scope adjustment that caught Thompson's attention, a subtle correction that suggested she was compensating for factors that the other students might not even notice. The third shot struck dead center. Time: 80 minutes, 43 seconds total time. All targets engaged successfully. The range fell silent, even allowing for the morning's surprising results. What they had just witnessed was performance that belonged in a different category entirely. Rapid precision shooting under stress, with movement between positions and time constraints, had not diminished Samantha's accuracy in the slightest. Lisa Chun was the first to speak. That was textbook execution, military-level tactical shooting. David Rodriguez stared at the course, his expensive equipment suddenly feeling less significant. I've been shooting competitively for 8 years, and I don't think I could have run that course that cleanly. Jake Sullivan shook his head slowly. Where did you learn to shoot like that? That wasn't recreational training. Thompson approached Samantha as she began clearing her rifle. His entire demeanor changed from the morning skepticism. All right, Cooper. I think it's time you told us exactly what your background really involves. Because what we just witnessed doesn't happen without extensive professional-level training. Samantha finished her clearing procedure before responding, using the time to consider how much of her story she was ready to share. I told you I started shooting for physical therapy reasons. What I didn't mention was that my doctor referred me to someone who specialized in helping people overcome physical limitations through sport. What kind of specialist? Thompson pressed. Dr. Elena Vasquez. She works with Olympic athletes and professional shooters who have had injuries or developed conditions that affect their performance. Her approach involves developing new neural pathways and compensation techniques. Asterisk, the name meant nothing to most of the group, but Lisa Chun's expression changed immediately. Elena Vasquez? The sports psychologist who worked with the Paralympic shooting team? She's legendary in certain circles. Getting training with her is like getting lessons from a guru. She worked with me for 2 years, Samantha continued. Not just shooting technique, but mental discipline, stress management, and methods for working around my condition rather than trying to overcome it. Thompson's expression was unreadable as he processed this information. In his world, credentials and training background were everything. The morning's performance had challenged his assumptions about physical limitations, but professional coaching from someone of Vasquez's caliber provided a rational explanation for abilities that had seemed impossible. Why didn't you mention this in your application? He asked. Because I wasn't sure it mattered. This course was described as advanced precision training, not Olympic-level coaching. I assumed my recreational background was what you wanted to hear about. David Rodriguez's frustration was becoming apparent. Recreational background? You've been training with one of the most elite shooting coaches in the country. That's like saying you learned tennis recreationally from Serena Williams. The coaching was medical, not competitive, Samantha replied calmly. I never intended to compete or pursue professional shooting. I just needed to find ways to maintain fine motor skills despite my condition. Thompson studied the course results, then looked back at Samantha. The tremor in her hands was still visible, still present, but his understanding of what that meant had completely changed. Instead of a limitation that should prevent effective shooting, it had apparently motivated a level of training and mental discipline that exceeded what most of his students achieved. Well, he said finally, I guess we'll see how you handle tomorrow's challenges. Because if today was your baseline, we're going to need to make things significantly more difficult to properly evaluate your capabilities. As the group prepared to move to the next phase of evaluation, the dynamic had shifted once again. Samantha was no longer the unlikely participant whose condition raised questions about her suitability. Instead, she had become the standard against which the others would measure themselves, carrying a level of expertise that none of them had anticipated. The desert sun was reaching its peak intensity, and the afternoon heat was beginning to affect everyone's comfort and concentration. But for Samantha Cooper, the real test was just beginning as her revealed background had elevated expectations to a level that would demand everything her specialized training had prepared her to deliver. The next morning brought an unexpected change in atmosphere. Word of Samantha's performance had spread beyond the immediate training group, attracting attention from other instructors and academy staff who wanted to witness what they'd heard, described in increasingly dramatic terms. By the time Thompson's group assembled for day 2, a small crowd of observers had gathered near Range 12, the academy's most challenging facility. Range 12 was known as the Crucible among students, a complex course designed to simulate the absolute worst-case scenarios that tactical shooters might face. It combined movement, obstacle negotiation, target identification, and precision shooting under extreme time pressure. The failure rate was over 90%, and even experienced operators often required multiple attempts to achieve passing scores. But it wasn't just the increased difficulty that made this morning different. Someone had made phone calls overnight. Dr. Elena Vasquez herself had driven up from Phoenix, her silver SUV pulling into the parking lot just as the morning briefing was scheduled to begin. She was a small, intense woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. Thompson's surprise was evident as he recognized the legendary coach climbing out of her vehicle. "Dr. Vasquez, what brings you to our academy?" "I heard one of my former patients was causing quite a stir," she replied, her slight accent revealing her Spanish heritage. "Samantha called me last night. Said people were having trouble believing her background story." David Rodriguez was staring openly, recognizing the name, if not the face. Lisa Chun straightened unconsciously, her military bearing responding to the presence of someone whose reputation preceded her. Jake Sullivan looked confused, still not fully grasping the significance of this woman's appearance. "You trained Cooper?" Thompson asked, though the answer was obvious. "For 2.5 years, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. One of the most dedicated students I've ever worked with. Also one of the most challenging cases I've encountered." She walked over to where Samantha stood, her expression softening slightly. "How are the hands today, Mia?" Samantha extended her arms, showing the familiar tremor that had become the subject of so much speculation. "Same as always. Some days better, some days worse, but never gone completely." Dr. Vasquez nodded, taking Samantha's hands in her own and feeling the tremor directly. "Good. If it had disappeared completely, I'd be worried that you'd lost your edge." The comment puzzled everyone listening. Thompson stepped closer, his curiosity overriding protocol. "Lost her edge? I don't understand." "The tremor isn't Samantha's limitation," Dr. Vasquez explained, still holding her former student's hands. "It's her advantage. Most shooters have to learn to find stillness artificially, to quiet their nervous system through breathing and mental discipline. Samantha's condition forced her to learn something much more sophisticated: how to shoot through movement, how to find precision in the midst of instability." She released Samantha's hands and turned to address the gathered crowd. "When she first came to me, she was devastated. A safety engineer who could no longer trust her hands to perform fine motor tasks. She thought her career was over, maybe her life as she knew it. But I saw something different: an opportunity to develop skills that most shooters never access because they never need to." David Rodriguez's expensive equipment suddenly seemed less relevant as he began to understand that the real competitive advantage wasn't gear, but the ability to perform under conditions that would destabilize everyone else. "The neural pathways that cause her tremor are constantly active," Dr. Vasquez continued. "So instead of teaching her to suppress them, I taught her to incorporate them into her shooting technique. Her hands are never still, but they're moving in patterns she's learned to predict and compensate for." Lisa Chun was absorbing this information with the analytical mindset of someone trained to understand tactical advantages. "So she's not shooting despite the tremor, she's shooting through it?" "Exactly. Most precision shooters need perfect conditions to achieve their best performance. Samantha's best performance comes when conditions are imperfect, because that's what she's trained for. The more stress, the more movement, the more instability in her environment, the more her training takes over. Thompson was beginning to understand why yesterday's challenging course had seemed to improve rather than diminish Samantha's performance. That's why the tactical course didn't throw her off. The stress and movement actually played to her strengths. Precisely, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. Though I suspect you haven't truly tested those strengths yet. It was both a challenge and an invitation, and Thompson recognized it as such. He gestured toward range 12, where the morning's exercise waited. The Crucible is our most demanding course, 90% failure rate, requires perfect execution under maximum stress. Dr. Vasquez smiled for the first time since arriving. Perfect. Samantha's specialty is in perfect execution that achieves perfect results. The crowd had grown larger, with academy staff and advanced students gathering to witness what had become an impromptu demonstration. Word was spreading through social media channels, with posts tagged #ShakingSniper and #TremorShooter, beginning to attract attention from the broader tactical shooting community. But not all the attention was positive. A group of competitive shooters who trained regularly at the academy had arrived, led by Marcus Webb, a nationally ranked precision rifle competitor, whose ego was legendary even among people accustomed to high-performance personalities. His expensive, custom rifle and sponsor-covered gear marked him as someone who took his reputation very seriously. "So this is the famous shaking shooter," Webb announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Interesting story, but let's see how it holds up when the pressure's really on." His tone carried an edge of hostility that went beyond healthy competition. In his world, shooting was about technical perfection, equipment optimization, and the kind of controlled precision that trembling hands should make impossible. Samantha's success challenged fundamental assumptions about what made someone an elite marksman. "Marcus," Thompson warned, recognizing the potential for conflict. "This is a training exercise, not a competition." "Everything's a competition," Webb replied dismissively, "especially when someone's claiming abilities that defy basic physiology." Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her small stature somehow commanding attention from the much larger man. "You doubt my students' abilities?" "I doubt convenient explanations for impossible performance," Webb shot back. "Elite shooting requires physical stability. Period. There's no workaround for shaking hands, regardless of what sports psychology theories suggest." The challenge was direct and public, creating exactly the kind of confrontation that Thompson had hoped to avoid. But Dr. Vasquez seemed unperturbed by the hostility, almost as if she'd expected it. "Interesting perspective," she said calmly. "Would you be willing to make your point more concrete?" Webb's competitive instincts were fully engaged now. "What do you have in mind?" "The Crucible course," Dr. Vasquez suggested. "You against Samantha. Same course, same conditions, same time limits. We'll let performance settle the question of whether stability is truly essential for precision shooting." The crowd's murmur indicated that this had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. Webb was known for his abilities, his equipment was cutting edge, and his competitive record spoke for itself. Against him, Samantha would face not just a challenging course, but an opponent whose reputation and ego demanded that he prove his point about the impossibility of precision shooting with unstable hands. Thompson looked between the two potential competitors, recognizing that this had moved beyond training into something that could either validate or destroy reputations. "I'm not sure this is appropriate." "I accept," Samantha said quietly, speaking. For the first time since her former coach had arrived, Webb's smile was predatory. "Excellent. Let's see if your miracle training can compete with real technique and proper equipment." As the crowd prepared to witness what had become an unofficial but very public challenge, The stakes had escalated far beyond a training exercise. This was now about validating or debunking everything that Dr. Vasquez had taught, everything that Samantha had learned to overcome her condition, and everything that Marcus Webb believed about the fundamental requirements for elite marksmanship. Desert sun climbed higher, the heat beginning to shimmer off the concrete surfaces of Range 12, where 15 targets waited at distances ranging from 100 to 500 yards. In less than an hour, one of them would face those targets under time pressure that would test not just shooting skills, but the ability to perform when failure would be witnessed by dozens of people and potentially broadcast to thousands more. Through social media, for Samantha Cooper, this was no longer about completing a training course. It was about proving that strength could emerge from what others saw as weakness, that the hands that shook the most might indeed hold the steadiest aim when everything was on the line. Range 12's preparation area buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with routine training. Academy staff members who should have been conducting other classes had found reasons to linger nearby. Students from advanced courses had abandoned their own exercises to witness what everyone was calling the challenge. Cell phones were everywhere, some live streaming to tactical shooting forums, others recording what might become either legendary footage or spectacular failure. Marcus Webb stood beside his custom rifle, a precision instrument that had cost more than many people's cars. Every component had been hand-selected and professionally tuned. A surgeon action mated to a Bartlein barrel, topped with a Schmidt and Bender scope that could resolve details at distances most shooters never attempted. His shooting mat was positioned with geometric precision, his ammunition arranged in perfect rows, his gear laid out with the meticulous organization of someone accustomed to performing under scrutiny. 50 feet away, Samantha Cooper sat quietly on a simple folding chair, her basic rifle case open beside her. The contrast with stark. Webb's setup looked like a mobile laboratory designed for ballistic perfection, while Samantha's gear appeared adequate but unremarkable. Her hands showed their characteristic tremor as she performed final equipment checks, a visual reminder of why most observers expected this competition to end badly for her. Dr. Vasquez stood nearby, her expression calm but watchful. She had seen her former student face challenges before, had witnessed the long journey from devastating injury to adaptive mastery. But this was different, a public test against an opponent whose reputation and ego demanded that he prove the impossibility of what Samantha had learned to do. Thompson reviewed the course parameters one final time, his voice carrying across the range. The crucible consists of 15 targets at distances from 100 to 500 yards. Competitors will move through 5 stations, engaging 3 targets from each position. Total time limit, 12 minutes. Miss any target or exceed the time limit, automatic disqualification. He paused, looking between the two competitors. This isn't a training exercise anymore. This is a live demonstration with witnesses and recording devices. Both competitors have agreed to these terms, but I want to be clear, failure here will be very public failure. Webb nodded confidently, his competitive experience evident in his relaxed posture and easy smile. He had performed under pressure countless times, had won matches in front of crowds much larger than this. The tremor in his opponent's hands was all the advantage he needed. "Questions?" Thompson asked. "Just one," Webb said, his voice loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "When my opponent fails to complete the course, will there be any excuses about medical conditions, or will we agree that physics and physiology determine shooting performance?" The comment drew murmurs from the crowd, some disapproving, others clearly agreeing with Webb's perspective. It was a calculated provocation designed to rattle Samantha's confidence before the competition even began. Samantha looked up from her equipment check, meeting Webb's gaze directly. "No excuses," she said simply. "Performance speaks for itself." Dr. Vasquez smiled slightly at her former student's response. In their years of training together, She had learned that Samantha's quiet confidence often masked a competitive fire that surprised people who mistook her calm demeanor for uncertainty. The course layout demanded everything that precision shooting required: prone positions for long-range accuracy, standing shots for speed and adaptability, kneeling shots for stability without support, and transitions between positions that tested cardiovascular fitness as much as marksmanship skill. The targets were steel plates of varying sizes, arranged to require different holds and compensations at each distance. "Competitors, take your positions," Thompson announced. "Webb, you'll shoot first. Cooper will follow immediately after." Webb approached the starting line with the fluid movements of an experienced competitor. His expensive gear was distributed perfectly for rapid access, his shooting positions practiced to the point of automation. He settled into his first prone position with textbook form, his rifle tracking smoothly onto the initial target at 200 yards. The crowd fell silent as Webb began his run. His first shot rang the steel cleanly, followed immediately by 2 more hits in rapid succession. His transitions between targets were efficient, his shooting rhythm steady and controlled. By the time he finished the first station and moved to the standing position, it was clear that his reputation was well-deserved. Webb's performance was clinical in its precision. Standing shots at varying distances, each one connecting solidly with metallic conformation. Kneeling positions handled with the kind of stability that suggested thousands of hours of practice. His movements were economical, his breathing controlled, his equipment performing exactly as designed. At Station 4, which required prone shots at 400 and 500 yards, Webb demonstrated why expensive optics and precision ammunition mattered. His shots connected with authority, the distant steel targets ringing clearly across the range. His final station was completed with time to spare, 15 targets engaged, 15 hits confirmed. Time, 9 minutes 37 seconds. Thompson announced, "Perfect score." The crowd's approval was immediate and sustained. Webb stood and acknowledged the applause with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to validation. His performance had been everything his reputation promised: technically flawless, efficiently executed, and delivered under pressure without visible stress. "Impressive shooting," Dr. Vasquez acknowledged, her tone respectful but neutral. Webb nodded, accepting the compliment while his eyes remained fixed on Samantha. "Physics doesn't lie," he said. "Precision shooting requires stability, and stability requires control. Everything else is just interesting theory." As Samantha approached the starting line, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Where Webb had moved with competitive swagger, she walked quietly, her basic gear slung over her shoulder, her hands showing the tremor that had become the focus of so much speculation. Several phones zoomed in on her hands, documenting the instability that should, according to conventional wisdom, make precision shooting impossible. The first station required prone shooting at 200, 250, and 300 yards. Samantha dropped into position smoothly, her movements efficient despite the visible tremor in her hands. Through her scope, the first target appeared sharp and clear, but her hands never achieved the rock-steady stability that Webb had demonstrated. Instead of fighting the tremor, Samantha did something that surprised the experienced shooters watching. She embraced it, timing her shots to work with the natural rhythm of her condition rather than against it. Her first shot broke during a natural pause in the tremor cycle, striking the 200-yard target cleanly, but it was her speed that caught everyone's attention. Where Webb had taken careful aim for each shot, Samantha's targets were engaged in rapid succession, her shots fired with a rhythm that seemed almost musical. The steel plates rang in steady succession: 200 yards, 250 yards, 300 yards each. Hit confirmed before moving to the transition. Station 2 required standing shots, the position that should have maximized the impact of any hand instability. Instead, Samantha's performance actually seemed to improve. Her shots connected with increasing authority, her movement between targets fluid and confident. How is she doing that? David Rodriguez whispered to Lisa Chun, both of them watching in fascination as Samantha's supposed limitation seemed to become an asset. She's not shooting through the tremor, Lisa realized. She's shooting with it, using the movement as part of her technique somehow. By station 3, the crowd's energy had shifted. What had begun as curiosity about whether Samantha could complete the course had evolved into amazement at how she was completing it. Her kneeling positions were handled with a fluidity that made Webb's textbook technique look rigid by comparison. Station 4 brought the long-range challenges that should have exposed any limitations in her equipment or technique. But as Samantha settled behind her basic rifle and engaged targets at 400 and 500 yards, something remarkable happened. Her shots didn't just hit, they connected with an authority that suggested precision rather than luck. "Impossible," Webb muttered, watching through binoculars as Samantha's budget optics delivered accuracy that matched his PREM IUM equipment. The final station required a combination of positions and distances, designed to test every aspect of marksmanship skill. As Samantha approached these final targets, the range had fallen completely silent except for the metallic confirmation of hits and the sound of her rifle cycling between shots. When her final shot rang the 500-yard steel, the silence stretched for several seconds before erupting into something that sounded more like astonishment than applause. "Time, 8 minutes, 12 seconds, Thompson announced, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Perfect score." The silence that followed Thompson's announcement stretched like a held breath. 8 minutes, 12 seconds. Not only had Samantha completed the crucible flawlessly, she had done it faster than Marcus Webb, using equipment that cost a fraction of his custom setup. The implications were staggering for everyone who had witnessed it, but perhaps no one more so than Webb himself. His face had gone pale, his confident posture replaced by something approaching shock. In his competitive career, he had lost matches. Before that was the nature of competition. But those losses had come against opponents using similar equipment, similar training methods, similar approaches to the fundamental challenge of precision shooting. This was different. This challenged everything he understood about what made elite marksmanship possible. "There has to be an explanation," Webb said, his voice loud enough to carry across the range. "Equipment malfunction, timing error, something." Thompson consulted his stopwatch and the electronic target confirmation system, both of which told the same story. All systems functioned normally. All targets were confirmed hit. Time was recorded electronically and manually. Dr. Vasquez approached, Webb with the calm demeanor of someone who had spent decades working with athletes struggling to accept realities that challenged their worldview. "The explanation is exactly what I told you earlier," she said gently. "Samantha learned to work with her condition rather than against it." "That's not possible," Webb insisted, his competitive ego rejecting what his eyes had witnessed. "Physics doesn't work that way. Tremoring hands can't produce precision shooting. There has to be medication, some kind of enhancement, something that explains this." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and the crowd's murmur indicated that Webb had crossed a line from skepticism into something uglier. Dr. Vasquez's expression hardened, but it was Samantha herself who responded. "You're welcome to request." "Medical testing," she said calmly, her hands still showing their characteristic tremor as she secured her rifle. "My medical records are available through my doctor. My training history is documented, and my condition has been verified by multiple neurologists. What you witnessed is the result of adaptive technique, not pharmaceutical enhancement." Lisa Chun stepped forward, her military background giving her authority in questions of performance enhancement. "I've seen shooters using everything from beta blockers to stimulants. This isn't what performance-enhancing drugs look like." This is skill, pure and simple. Jake Sullivan nodded agreement. In law enforcement, we see a lot of people trying to shortcut their way to competence. This is the opposite, someone who had to work twice as hard to achieve what others take for granted. But Webb wasn't ready to accept defeat, especially not in front of a crowd that was rapidly shifting its sympathy away from him. One course, one performance, under perfect conditions, he said dismissively. Anyone can get lucky once. It was Dr. Vasquez who saw the opportunity in Webb's continued resistance. She exchanged a glance with Samantha, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "What would convince you?" the coach asked Webb directly. "Proof that this wasn't a fluke," Webb replied immediately. "Real conditions, real pressure, not just hitting stationary targets on a calm day." Thompson sensed where this was heading and tried to intervene. "I think we've seen enough demonstrations for one day. The speed course." Dr. Vasquez interrupted, her voice cutting across Thompson's attempt at diplomacy. 15 targets in minimum time. Moving targets, irregular timing, maximum stress. The speed course was legendary at the academy, a test that pushed reaction time and precision to their absolute limits. It consisted of 15 electronic targets that appeared at random intervals across a 180-degree field of fire. Competitors had to identify, acquire, and engage each target as it appeared, with accuracy requirements that eliminated any possibility of spray-and-pray tactics. The course record was held by a former Delta Force operator who had completed it in 18 seconds with no missed shots. Most experienced shooters required 30 seconds or more if they could complete it at all. The failure rate was even higher than the Crucible because the mental processing demands were as challenging as the physical requirements. "That's not a reasonable comparison," Thompson protested. "The speed course requires different skills entirely. I accept," Samantha said quietly, cutting off Thompson's objection. Webb's eyes lit up with renewed confidence. This was more like familiar territory, a test of reflexes in split-second decision-making where expensive equipment and professional training should provide clear advantages. "Now we'll see what happens when luck runs out," he said. The crowd's energy shifted again as word spread that the competition was continuing. More academy staff appeared, drawn by reports of what they were hearing described in increasingly dramatic terms. Several people were live streaming now, their phone screens showing viewer counts that suggested word was spreading beyond the immediate tactical shooting community. Dr. Vasquez moved close to Samantha as they prepared for the next challenge. "You don't have to prove anything more," she said quietly. "You've already demonstrated everything I taught you." "This isn't about proving anything to him," Samantha replied, checking her rifle one final time. "It's about proving something to myself." The speed course occupied a separate range designed specifically for reactive shooting. Electronic targets were mounted on pneumatic systems that could present them at any angle, at any time, for durations measured in fractions of seconds. The course computer was programmed with randomized sequences that prevented memorization or prediction. Webb prepared his equipment with renewed confidence, his expensive optics and hair trigger modifications designed for exactly this kind of rapid engagement. His competitive experience included similar challenges, and he understood the mental game as well as the physical requirements. "Same rules as before," Thompson announced. "Webb shoots first, Cooper follows. 15 targets, random presentation, maximum time limit of 60 seconds. Miss more than 2 targets or exceed the time limit, automatic disqualification." Webb settled into the shooting booth, his rifle at ready position, his body coiled with competitive energy. "Start the sequence," he called out. The first target appeared at the far left of his field of fire, a steel plate that flashed into view for just 2 seconds. Webb's rifle tracked smoothly, his shot connecting cleanly before the target disappeared. The second target appeared at a different location than the third, each engagement requiring rapid acquisition and precise shot placement. Webb's performance was impressive by any standard. His movements fluid and controlled, his shots finding their marks with mechanical precision. His expensive equipment performed exactly as designed, his optics providing crystal-clear target resolution, even during rapid transitions. By the time the 15th target disappeared, Webb had missed only one shot, a difficult angle that had appeared for barely a second at the edge of his peripheral vision. Time: 24 seconds, 14 hits. The course computer announced it was a genuinely excellent performance, well above average for the course and competitive with academy records. Webb stood with justified satisfaction, his confidence restored by a demonstration of skills that matched his reputation and equipment. "Beat that," he said to Samantha, his competitive swagger returning. But as Samantha approached the shooting booth, something had changed in her demeanor. The quiet hesitation that had characterized her earlier interactions was gone, replaced by a focused intensity that reminded Dr. Vasquez of their most challenging training sessions. Samantha settled into position, her rifle at ready, her breathing controlled and steady. Her hands showed their characteristic tremor, but her grip was solid, her stance balanced. "Ready," she announced. The course computer initiated the sequence, and the first target appeared with mechanical suddenness. Samantha's response was immediate, not just fast, but seemingly instantaneous, as if she had anticipated the target's appearance. Her shot connected cleanly, her rifle already tracking toward the next probable location. What happened next was something that none of the experienced shooters watching had ever witnessed. Samantha didn't just engage targets as they appeared, she seemed to flow between them, her movements continuous and fluid, her shots fired with a rhythm that suggested musical timing rather than mechanical precision. The tremor in her hands, which should have slowed her target acquisition, instead seemed to provide a constant state of readiness. While other shooters had to transition from stillness to movement for each new target, Samantha's hands were already in motion, already adjusting, already compensating. Target after target flashed into view and disappeared, each one engaged cleanly. Before vanishing, her rifle cycled with metronomic precision, her brass casings ejecting in a steady stream that spoke to sustained, rapid fire rather than careful, deliberate shots. When the 15th target vanished and the course computer processed the results, the silence was deeper than before. Time: 12 seconds, 15 hits. 12 seconds. She had not only completed the course faster than anyone present had thought possible, she had done it with perfect accuracy while displaying the physical condition that everyone assumed made such performance impossible. Webb stood frozen, his expensive rifle hanging loose in his grip, his understanding of competitive shooting fundamentally shattered by what he had just witnessed. The woman with tremoring hands had just redefined what elite marksmanship could look like. The aftermath of Samantha's 12-second run was unlike anything the Precision Firearms Academy had experienced in its 15-year history. The crowd that had gathered to witness what many expected to be an embarrassing failure stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just seen. Cell phone screens glowed as people frantically replayed recorded footage, slowing down the video to understand how 15 targets had been engaged with perfect accuracy in the time it took most shooters to acquire their first sight picture. Marcus Webb remained frozen at his shooting position, his custom rifle still in his hands, but forgotten. The competitive confidence that had defined his approach to the challenge had evaporated, replaced by something approaching existential confusion. In his world, precision shooting followed predictable rules. Stable platform plus quality equipment, plus trained technique equals consistent results. What Samantha had demonstrated violated those fundamental principles so completely that it challenged his understanding of what was physically possible. Dr. Vasquez approached her former student with quiet satisfaction, but her expression was tempered by concern for how Samantha was processing the attention and scrutiny that would inevitably follow this performance. "How do you feel?" she asked simply, Samantha was securing her rifle with the same methodical care she had shown all morning, her hands displaying their characteristic tremor as she performed the familiar routine. "Relieved," she said honestly. "For 3 years, I've wondered if what we accomplished in training was real, or if it was just artificial conditions that wouldn't hold up under genuine pressure. And now you know. Now I know." Thompson stepped forward, his role as head instructor requiring him to address what had just occurred, though his 20 years of teaching experience had provided no framework for handling a situation like this. "Cooper, what you've demonstrated today goes beyond anything we've seen at this facility. I need to understand the techniques you've developed, because if they can be taught to others, they can't," Dr. Vasquez interrupted gently but firmly. "What you witnessed is the result of specific neural adaptation to Samantha's particular condition. The techniques I developed for her work because of her tremor, not in spite of it. Someone without her specific neurological patterns couldn't replicate this performance." David Rodriguez, who had spent the morning watching his expensive equipment and years of experience become irrelevant, approached with the expression of someone wrestling with uncomfortable realizations. "So you're saying her condition actually makes her a better shooter?" "I'm saying her condition forced her to develop approaches that wouldn't occur to shooters who don't face her challenges," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Most precision shooters spend years learning to minimize movement, to find perfect stillness. Samantha learned to embrace controlled movement, to work with her body's natural rhythms rather than fighting them." Lisa Chun, her military analytical mindset engaged, was studying the target system's electronic display, showing Samantha's engagement times. "These intervals are impossibly consistent. Most shooters show variation in their reaction times, but yours are almost metronomic. How is that possible with a tremor condition?" "The tremor provides constant sensory feedback," Samantha explained, warming to a subject she had spent years understanding. "Most people have to consciously check their hand position, their sight alignment, their trigger finger placement. My hands are always moving, so I'm always receiving tactile information about my weapon's orientation and my body's position." Jake Sullivan was nodding slowly as he began to grasp the implications. "So while the rest of us are trying to achieve stillness, you're working with constant motion. That means you're always ready to adjust, always in a state of dynamic stability." "Exactly. When a target appears, I don't have to transition from static to dynamic. I'm already dynamic, already adjusting, already compensating." Webb finally found his voice, though it carried none of his earlier arrogance. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "If what you're describing is teachable, if these principles can be adapted, they can't be," Dr. Vasquez repeated, but her tone was gentler now. "What Samantha achieved required her specific neural condition, combined with thousands of hours of specialized training, combined with a level of mental discipline that most people couldn't sustain. This isn't a technique you can learn from a manual." The crowd had grown larger as words spread throughout the academy, with students and instructors arriving to witness what social media posts were describing in increasingly dramatic terms. Several professional shooters had driven from nearby facilities after seeing live-stream footage, wanting to verify reports that seemed too extraordinary to believe. Among the newcomers was Captain Sarah Mitchell from the local police department's tactical team, whose reputation for precision shooting was well established in law enforcement circles. She had arrived expecting to debunk what she assumed were exaggerated social media claims, but the electronic target records and witness accounts were forcing her to reconsider her skepticism. "I've seen some remarkable shooting in my career," Captain Mitchell announced to the crowd, "but this represents a fundamental shift in how we understand marksmanship capabilities. If these techniques could be adapted for law enforcement training, Captain," Dr. Vasquez interjected, "I understand the interest, but what you witnessed today is the result of a very specific set of circumstances that can't be replicated in general training programs. Samantha's condition forced adaptations that wouldn't be necessary or beneficial for officers with normal hand stability. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Academy Director Colonel James Harrison, whose military bearing and no-nonsense demeanor immediately commanded attention. He had been summoned from an off-site meeting by increasingly urgent phone calls describing events that seemed to defy credibility. "Thompson, I need a briefing on what's happening here," Harrison said curtly. Thompson quickly outlined the morning's events, from Webb's initial challenge through both shooting demonstrations. Harrison listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing as he processed information that challenged his own extensive background in military marksmanship. "And the electronic systems confirmed these times and accuracy scores?" Harrison asked. "Yes, sir. All equipment functioned normally. All results were recorded by multiple systems." Harrison studied Samantha, taking in her basic equipment, her civilian clothes, and the tremor in her hands that had become the focus of so much attention. "Miss Cooper, what is your interest in our academy? Are you seeking instructor credentials, military consultation, competitive sponsorship?" It was a reasonable question from someone trying to understand the implications of what had occurred. In Harrison's experience, exceptional performance usually came with specific objectives: career advancement, competitive goals, commercial opportunities. "I'm here because I wanted to test myself," Samantha said simply. "For 3 years I've wondered if the techniques Dr. Vasquez taught me would hold up under real pressure, against experienced shooters in unfamiliar conditions. Today answered that question. And now that you have your answer?" Samantha considered the question carefully, aware that her response would be recorded by multiple devices and potentially shared with thousands of viewers. "Now I know that what others might see as a limitation can become a strength if you're willing to work with it instead of against it." The philosophical implications of her statement weren't lost on the crowd, many of whom were processing their own assumptions about disability, capability, and the relationship between physical condition and performance. Webb's expensive equipment suddenly seemed less relevant than the mental approach that had enabled Samantha to turn a neurological challenge into a competitive advantage. Dr. Vasquez watched the interactions with the satisfaction of seeing years of patient work validated, but also with concern for how this attention might affect her former student. "Samantha," she said quietly, "you've proven everything you needed to prove. The rest is just noise." But the noise was becoming significant. Social media engagement was exploding as footage of the 12-second speed course run spread across platforms dedicated to tactical shooting, competitive marksmanship, and disability advocacy. Comments ranged from technical analysis by experienced shooters to inspirational responses from people facing their own physical challenges. The hashtag #ShakingSniper had gone viral, with view counts climbing into the hundreds of thousands as the story spread beyond the tactical shooting community into mainstream social media. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, recognizing the human interest angle of someone overcoming a physical limitation to achieve extraordinary performance. For Samantha Cooper, standing in the Arizona desert heat surrounded by people trying to understand what they had witnessed, the attention was both validating and overwhelming. She had come to the academy to test herself against others, to determine if her specialized training was genuine or artificial. The answer was now clear, but it had created new questions about what came next, and whether she was prepared for the scrutiny that accompanied redefining what people thought was possible. 6 months after that desert morning in Arizona, the world of precision shooting had fundamentally changed. The video of Samantha Cooper's 12-second speed course run had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, spawning documentaries, academic studies, and a complete reevaluation of how the shooting sports community understood the relationship between physical condition and marksmanship capability. The precision Firearms Academy had become an unlikely pilgrimage site for people facing their own physical challenges. Colonel Harrison found himself fielding inquiries from adaptive sports organizations, medical research institutions, and individuals who had discovered that what they perceived as limitations might actually contain hidden strengths. The Academy's approach to instruction had evolved to incorporate concepts that Dr. Vasquez had pioneered, not as universal techniques, but as examples of how creative adaptation could overcome apparent impossibility. Dr. Elena Vasquez's practice had expanded exponentially, with referrals coming from neurologists, sports psychologists, and rehabilitation specialists around the world. Her approach to working with athletes who had developed neurological conditions was no longer considered experimental. It had become a recognized field of study with applications far beyond shooting sports. What Samantha demonstrated wasn't just exceptional marksmanship, Dr. Vasquez explained to a medical conference in Boston, her presentation slides showing frame-by-frame analysis of that 12-second run. She proved that neurological differences, when properly understood and trained for, can create capabilities that traditional approaches never access. The medical community had embraced Samantha's case as a breakthrough in understanding neuroplasticity and adaptive motor control. Research papers analyzing her techniques had been published in journals ranging from sports medicine to neurology, with her permission to study her condition, providing insights that benefited thousands of patients. Dealing with similar challenges, Marcus Webb's story had taken a different trajectory. The public nature of his defeat had initially devastated his competitive career, but his eventual response had surprised everyone who knew his reputation for arrogance. Instead of retreating from the spotlight, he had become one of the most vocal advocates for expanding definitions of what constituted elite performance. I spent years believing that precision shooting was about eliminating variables, Webb explained to a gathering of competitive shooters in Nevada. Samantha taught me that sometimes the variables are actually advantages if you're skilled enough to use them. My equipment is still exceptional, my technique is still solid, but I understand now that there are approaches I never considered because I never needed to. His custom rifle setup had been modified to incorporate training techniques that mimicked some of the challenges Samantha faced naturally. It wasn't an attempt to replicate her condition, but rather an effort to develop the kind of adaptive control that her training had necessitated. Thompson's Advanced Precision course had become the most sought-after training program in the country. Not because he was teaching Samantha's techniques, but because he was teaching the mindset that had made those techniques possible. "We can't give you tremoring hands," he would tell new students, "but we can teach you to work with whatever challenges you face instead of being defeated by them." The course waiting list stretched 18 months, with applications coming from law enforcement, military special operations, competitive shooters, and individuals who simply wanted to test their own assumptions about what they could achieve. Under pressure. Samantha herself had chosen a path that surprised many who expected her to capitalize on her viral fame. Rather than pursuing competitive shooting careers or equipment endorsements, she had returned to her original profession as a safety engineer, but with a new focus on helping companies understand how physical differences could enhance rather than compromise workplace safety. "The chemical plant accident that caused my tremor initially ended my career," she explained to a workplace safety conference in Denver. "But the skills I developed to cope with that condition made me better at identifying safety risks and developing adaptive procedures." What seemed like a career-ending disability became the foundation for expertise I never would have developed otherwise. Her consulting work focused on helping organizations move beyond compliance-based approaches to safety toward adaptive systems that recognized human variability as an asset rather than a liability. The same principles that had enabled her extraordinary marksmanship were being applied to industrial safety, healthcare procedures, and emergency response protocols. The social media phenomenon that had begun with #ShakingSniper had evolved into broader conversations about disability, capability, and the assumptions that society makes about physical differences. Disability advocacy groups had embraced Samantha's story as evidence that limitations often exist more in perception than in reality. What Samantha demonstrated, explained disability rights attorney Patricia Williams during a television interview, is that our society's understanding of disability is often based on assumptions rather than evidence. We assume that tremoring hands can't provide precision, that physical differences must be limitations, that accommodation means accepting reduced capability. Her performance challenges all of those assumptions. The broader impact extended beyond shooting sports or disability advocacy. Business schools were teaching case studies based on Samantha's approach to turning challenges into advantages. Sports psychology programs were incorporating her training. Methods into curricula focused on helping athletes overcome injuries or adapt to changing physical capabilities. Dr. Vasquez had been approached by Olympic programs, professional sports teams, and military special operations units, seeking to understand whether her techniques could be adapted for their specific challenges. Every situation is different, she would explain, but the principle remains constant: work with your reality instead of fighting against it. The Precision Firearms Academy had established the Cooper Innovation Center, a research facility dedicated to exploring adaptive techniques for shooters facing various physical challenges. The center worked with veterans dealing with combat injuries, law enforcement officers recovering from line-of-duty injuries, and competitive shooters whose careers had been threatened by medical conditions. Samantha's legacy isn't just about shooting, Colonel Harrison explained to the center's board of directors. It's about proving that human potential is far more flexible than we typically assume. When we stop trying to force everyone into the same mold, we discover capabilities that were always there but never developed. The center's first year had produced remarkable results, with participants achieving performance levels that traditional training approaches had suggested were impossible, given their physical conditions. Veterans with prosthetic limbs were setting accuracy records, officers with vision impairments were excelling in low-light scenarios, and competitive shooters with various neurological conditions were discovering their own versions of what Samantha had pioneered. Webb had become a regular instructor at the center, his competitive background providing valuable insights into high-pressure performance, while his experience being defeated by unconventional approaches gave him credibility with students facing their own challenges. The biggest barrier most people face isn't their physical condition, he would tell new students. It's their assumption that their condition prevents excellence. Once you abandon that assumption, you can start discovering what's actually possible. As for Samantha Cooper herself, she had returned to a version of the quiet life she had preferred before viral fame changed everything. Her consulting work was fulfilling. Her original passion for safety engineering had been revitalized, and the tremor in her hands continued exactly as it always had, a constant reminder that what others might see as weakness could become the foundation for extraordinary strength. On weekends, she still visited shooting ranges, though usually smaller local facilities where she could practice without drawing crowds or cameras. The rifle she carried was the same basic setup that had outperformed equipment costing 10 times as much, proof that capability resided more in adaptation than in gear. The tremor that had once threatened to end her career had instead opened doors to achievements she had never imagined possible. Her hands still shook, would always shake, but she had learned something that changed not just her life, but the lives of countless others who watched her story and realized that their own perceived limitations might actually be untapped strengths waiting for the right approach to unlock their potential. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is proving that what everyone assumes is impossible is simply a challenge that requires a different kind of solution. Sometimes the hands that shake the most are indeed the ones that hold the steadiest aim when everything is on the line. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.